What if I told you that an 11-year-old school dropout once controlled more money than the entire U.S. government? That this same man could start wars with a single letter, bankrupt entire companies for fun, and marry his own cousins? Twice. Meet the most dangerous businessman who ever lived, and the twisted genius behind America's economic backbone. This is the story of Cornelius Vanderbilt, a man so ruthless that his enemies literally called him a Commodore of chaos, yet so brilliant that he single-handedly built the infrastructure that would make America the economic superpower it is today. By the time he died, he possessed more wealth than some entire countries, but the path he took to get there would make even today's most controversial billionaires look like choir boys. Our story begins in 1810 with a dirt-poor family and a field full of rocks that would change American history forever. Cornelius Vanderbilt was born into a family of servants. His ancestors had come to America not as pioneers seeking fortune, but as indentured workers barely above slaves. At age 11, while other kids were learning to read and write, Cornelius made a decision that would horrify modern parents, but set him on a path to unimaginable wealth. He dropped out of school permanently and went to work on his father's ferry, hauling goods across New York Harbor. But here's where the story gets interesting. This wasn't just child labor. This was the beginning of the most calculated business education in American history. After 5 years of learning every aspect of the ferry business, 16-year-old Cornelius saw his opportunity. He wanted his own boat, his own customers, his own empire. But there was one problem. He had no money. So he went to his mother with a proposal that would become the template for every future business deal he'd ever make. She had saved up exactly $100, enough for him to buy a small sailboat, but she wasn't just going to hand it over. Her condition was simple but brutal. Cornelius had to clear an entire field of rocks so she could farm it. Now, most teenagers would have seen this as backbreaking labor, but Cornelius saw it as his first hostile takeover. Instead of doing the work himself, he convinced every local kid in the neighborhood to help him clear that field by promising them something they desperately wanted: free rides on his future boat. Think about the psychology here. At 16, he'd already figured out how to get other people to do his dirty work by offering them something that would cost him nothing but would be invaluable to them. He manipulated an entire workforce of children into building his business foundation for free. This wasn't just smart. This was sociopathic levels of strategic thinking. The field got cleared. His mother handed over the $100, and Cornelius Vanderbilt bought his first boat. But what happened next would establish a pattern that would terrify American business for the next 60 years. Cornelius immediately put his boat into service, ferrying passengers and cargo between Staten Island and Manhattan. But he faced a problem that every entrepreneur knows: competition. There were dozens of other boat operators doing exactly the same thing, many with bigger boats and more experience. So Cornelius deployed what would become known as the Vanderbilt playbook. Rule number 1. If you can't beat them with quality, destroy them with price. He began offering the cheapest fares on the market, undercutting every single competitor so aggressively that people couldn't believe the prices were real. His competitors thought he was an amateur who would burn through his money and disappear within months. They were wrong. See, this wasn't just competitive pricing. This was economic warfare. Cornelius had calculated exactly how long he could operate at a loss. And more importantly, he'd figured out that most of his competitors couldn't match his endurance. While they were trying to maintain profit margins, he was playing a completely different game. He was willing to lose money on every single trip because he understood something that wouldn't become business school doctrine for another century. Market dominance is worth temporary losses. Every customer who rode his cheap ferry was one less customer for his competition, and every day his competitors operated at a loss to match his prices was a day closer to their bankruptcy. The strategy worked exactly as he'd planned. One by one, his competitors either went out of business or were forced to sell their boats at desperate prices. And guess who was there to buy those boats? Cornelius systematically acquired his competition's assets for pennies on the dollar, and with each acquisition, his fleet grew larger and his dominance more complete. But here's the truly diabolical part. Once he'd eliminated enough competition, he raised his prices back to profitable levels. His customers had no choice but to pay, because he'd destroyed their alternatives. This cycle of undercutting, acquiring, and monopolizing would become his signature move for the rest of his career. By age 19, Cornelius had built enough of a reputation that the U.S. government came calling during the War of 1812. They needed ships to transport soldiers, and they were willing to pay premium prices for reliable service. While most people saw the war as a tragedy, Cornelius saw dollar signs. His government contracts during the war generated massive profits that he immediately reinvested into more boats, more routes, and more market dominance. But success in business came at a horrific cost in his personal life. And this is where the story takes a much darker turn. Despite working 18-hour days building his empire, Cornelius found time to marry his first cousin Sophia and father 13 children with her. But if you're expecting a heartwarming family story, prepare to be disappointed. Cornelius was as ruthless with his family as he was with his business competitors. Reports from the time describe him as completely neglecting his wife and children, treating them more like business liabilities than family members. The most shocking example of this came when he had his own wife committed to an insane asylum, not because she was actually mentally ill, but because she was interfering with his business activities. Even more disturbing, he later had one of his sons committed to the same asylum simply because the boy suffered from epileptic seizures, which Cornelius viewed as a sign of weakness and mental deficiency. Think about the psychology of a man who could show more mercy to business competitors than to his own children. This wasn't just neglect. This was active cruelty driven by his obsession with strength and success. His family lived in constant fear of disappointing him because they knew he was capable of literally having them locked away if they became inconvenient. But while his personal life was falling apart, his business empire was about to explode into something unprecedented. By the late 1820s, Cornelius identified the next technological revolution that would make him not just wealthy, but historically wealthy. Steamboats. Steam technology was transforming transportation, making it faster and more efficient than anything that had come before. Most businessmen would have gradually transitioned their fleets, but Cornelius wasn't most businessmen. He bet everything on steam technology and began converting his entire operation almost overnight. Once again, he deployed his signature strategy of aggressive price undercutting, but this time on a scale that shocked the entire transportation industry. He didn't just offer lower prices. He offered some routes completely free. Imagine trying to compete with someone who's giving away their service for nothing. His competitors couldn't understand the mathematics of how he could possibly sustain such losses. But Cornelius understood something they didn't. He had deeper pockets and longer patience than anyone else in the market, and he was willing to operate at massive losses for months or even years, if it meant eliminating competition permanently. The results were devastating for his competitors and revolutionary for American transportation. Entire steamboat companies went bankrupt trying to match his prices. Others simply paid him enormous sums of money to leave their territories alone rather than face financial destruction. For example, when Cornelius began operating on the Hudson River, the existing Steamboat Association paid him $100,000, equivalent to millions today, just to stay out of their territory. They calculated it was cheaper to pay him tribute than to compete with his suicidal pricing strategies. Every time Cornelius received one of these massive payoffs or bought out a bankrupt competitor, his fleet grew larger and his power more concentrated. He was essentially being paid to not compete, then using that money to dominate other markets. It was the perfect business model. Get paid by your enemies to leave them alone, then use their money to destroy other enemies elsewhere. By the 1840s, people weren't just calling him Commodore Vanderbilt out of respect, they were calling him that out of fear. But Cornelius was never content with what he had, and in 1849, he identified an opportunity that would dwarf everything he'd accomplished so far. Gold had been discovered in California, triggering the largest mass migration in American history. Hundreds of thousands of people were desperately trying to get to California, and since there was no transcontinental railroad yet, they had to go by ship. Most people focus on the prospectors who got rich finding gold, or the merchants who got rich selling supplies to prospectors, but the real money was in controlling the transportation that made the entire gold rush possible. Cornelius immediately began offering ship routes to California, but where he separated himself from every other transportation company was in finding a route that nobody else had thought of. While everyone else was using the established path through Panama, Cornelius negotiated an exclusive deal with the government of Nicaragua to create a route that was 600 miles shorter. This wasn't just a minor competitive advantage. This was a game-changing innovation that made his trips faster, cheaper, and more profitable than anything his competitors could offer. The Nicaragua route became Cornelius's greatest business triumph. Every single person rushing to California who chose his ships put money directly into his pocket, and because his route was superior, most of them did choose his ships. He was essentially collecting a tax on the entire California gold rush, making money from both directions as prospectors went west and gold came east. For almost 4 years, he dominated this incredibly lucrative market, building wealth at a rate that was unprecedented in American history. But then Cornelius made a mistake that almost destroyed everything he'd built. For the first time in his adult life, he decided to take a vacation. At age 59, after working essentially non-stop since he was 11 years old, he bought a massive yacht and took his family on a tour of Europe. It sounds like a well-deserved break for a man who'd worked himself to exhaustion building an empire, but it was actually the setup for one of the most dramatic business betrayals in American history. While Cornelius was sailing around Europe, he'd left his Nicaragua transportation business in the hands of two partners named Morgan and Garrison. These men had worked with him for years and had earned his trust, but the moment he left the country, they saw an opportunity to cut him out entirely. They made a secret deal with William Walker, an American adventurer who had literally invaded Nicaragua and declared himself president. In exchange for recognizing Walker's illegitimate government, Walker would transfer Cornelius's exclusive transportation rights to Morgan and Garrison, cutting Cornelius out of his own business. When Cornelius found out about this betrayal while still in Europe, his response became legendary in American business circles. He sent Morgan and Garrison what might be the most terrifying business letter ever written. "Gentlemen, you have undertaken to cheat me. I won't sue you, for the law is too slow. I'll ruin you. Yours truly, Cornelius Vanderbilt." 13 words that would change the course of Central American history. Most people would have returned to America, hired lawyers, and fought the betrayal in court. But Cornelius wasn't most people, and his idea of justice was far more comprehensive than any legal system could provide. He immediately set up a competing transportation company and began his signature strategy of offering impossibly low prices to steal customers. But this time, it wasn't just about business competition. It was about complete destruction. Cornelius used his wealth and connections to create a total economic blockade of Nicaragua. He convinced other Central American countries not to recognize Walker's government, cutting off diplomatic and trade relationships. He funded and organized a military coalition of neighboring countries to literally invade Nicaragua and overthrow Walker's government. Think about the scale of what he accomplished. A single businessman, operating from private resources, successfully orchestrated the overthrow of an entire national government because they had interfered with his business interests. The war he helped start resulted in Walker's defeat and exile, the collapse of Morgan and Garrison's transportation business, and the restoration of Cornelius's exclusive rights in Nicaragua. But more than that, it sent a message to the entire business world that crossing Cornelius Vanderbilt didn't just mean commercial competition, it could mean the literal destruction of everything you'd ever built. As he had promised in his letter, he had utterly ruined those who had tried to cheat him. By the time Cornelius returned to America, he was approaching 60 years old, an age when most successful businessmen would be thinking about retirement and enjoying their wealth. But Cornelius was just getting started on what would become his greatest and most transformative business venture. He had recognized that the future of American transportation wasn't on the water. It was on land, specifically on railroad tracks. The railroad industry in the 1860s was fragmented and chaotic, with dozens of small, independent companies operating disconnected routes. Most businessmen saw this as a mature industry with limited growth potential, but Cornelius saw the greatest consolidation opportunity in American history. He began systematically selling off his fleet of ships and steamboats, liquidating decades of maritime investments to fund what would become the largest railroad empire the world had ever seen. But before we dive into his railroad domination, we need to address what might be the weirdest chapter in this already bizarre story. In 1868, Cornelius's first wife Sophia died, ending a marriage that had lasted nearly 50 years. Most 74-year-old widowers would have spent their remaining years in quiet solitude, but within a year Cornelius had remarried. His new wife was a woman named Frank Armstrong Crawford, and yes, you read that correctly, his wife's name was Frank. Apparently her parents had agreed to name their child after a male friend, and when they had a daughter instead of a son, they stuck with the name Frank anyway. But here's where the story gets truly unbelievable. Frank was not only 43 years younger than Cornelius, she was also his cousin. So let's recap this situation. Cornelius's first marriage was to his cousin Sophia, and after she died, he immediately married another one of his cousins named Frank, who was young enough to be his granddaughter. Even by the standards of the 1800s, when cousin marriage was more socially acceptable, this was considered extremely weird. Here was a man who had traveled all over the world, met thousands of people, and had access to the highest levels of society, yet both of his wives were his relatives. The Frank situation tells us something important about Cornelius's psychology. Despite all his wealth and power, he remained fundamentally suspicious of outsiders and most comfortable with family relationships he could control. Frank wasn't just a wife. She was a business asset who couldn't betray him the way Morgan and Garrison had, because family loyalty was something he understood and could manipulate. With his personal life settled in its characteristically strange way, Cornelius turned his full attention to railroads, and what happened next would transform not just his personal wealth but the entire American economy. He didn't just want to own some railroad companies, he wanted to create a single, unified transportation network that would connect the entire eastern United States under his control. The strategy he employed was the same one that had worked with ferries and steamboats, but scaled up to an almost unimaginable level. He began acquiring railroad companies through a combination of financial pressure, competitive undercutting, and strategic buyouts. But this wasn't just about adding more miles of track to his portfolio. It was about creating network effects that would make his railroad empire exponentially more valuable than the sum of its parts. See, individual railroad companies were vulnerable to competition, but an integrated network of railroads created a monopoly that was almost impossible to challenge. If you wanted to ship goods from New York to Chicago, you might have to use 5 different railroad companies, each with different rates, schedules, and reliability standards. But if Cornelius controlled all 5 of those companies, he could offer seamless, integrated service that no competitor could match, and he could charge premium prices for that convenience. The execution of this strategy was masterful and ruthless. Cornelius would identify key railroad routes and either buy the companies that operated them or drive them into bankruptcy through price competition. He would then integrate these acquisitions into his growing network, creating efficiencies and competitive advantages that made each new acquisition more valuable than it had been as an independent company. By the 1870s, Cornelius controlled the largest railroad network in the world, with routes connecting New York to Chicago and dozens of cities in between. His trains carried passengers, freight, mail, and literally everything that moved through the American economy. He had achieved something that no businessman before him had ever accomplished. He had gained monopolistic control over the infrastructure that the entire national economy depended on. The financial results were staggering. Cornelius's railroad empire generated profits on a scale that dwarfed everything he'd accomplished with ships and steamboats. More importantly, these weren't just businesses. They were strategic assets that gave him influence over American economic policy, political decisions, and even military operations. During the Civil War, his railroads had transported Union troops and supplies, making him not just wealthy, but politically powerful. As Cornelius entered his final years, he began to show signs of the philanthropy that often comes with extreme old age and wealth. He established Vanderbilt University with a $1 million donation, which at the time was the largest charitable gift in American history. He also made smaller donations to various causes and institutions, creating a public image of a reformed robber baron who had learned to use his wealth for social good. But anyone who thought age had mellowed Cornelius was about to be proven wrong. Even as his health declined and he became increasingly bedridden, he remained as fierce and aggressive as ever. When reporters gathered outside his mansion to cover his illness, the 81-year-old Cornelius became so enraged that he had to be physically restrained from attacking them. His family and doctors literally had to hold him down to prevent him from going outside and fighting journalists with his bare hands. This incident perfectly captures who Cornelius remained until the very end. A man whose first instinct was always to attack rather than retreat, to fight rather than negotiate, to dominate rather than compromise. Age and illness might have weakened his body, but they never touched the aggressive core of his personality that had driven him from a $100 loan to unimaginable wealth and power. Cornelius Vanderbilt died on January 4, 1877, at the age of 82. The New York Times reported that the immediate cause of his death was exhaustion brought on by long suffering from a complication of chronic disorders. But the real cause of his death was simpler. He had finally worn out a body that he'd been pushing to its limits for over 70 years. At the time of his death, Cornelius's fortune was estimated at approximately $100 million, but that number doesn't capture the true scale of his wealth. Adjusted for inflation, his fortune would be worth over $200 billion in today's money, making him one of the wealthiest individuals in human history. More remarkably, it's estimated that he personally controlled about 1/9 of all the currency in circulation in the United States at the time of his death. Think about what that means. A single individual owned more than 11% of all the money in America. No modern billionaire, not Jeff Bezos, not Elon Musk, not anyone has ever controlled that large a percentage of their nation's total wealth. Cornelius didn't just get rich, he became so wealthy that he represented a significant portion of the entire American economy. Despite this incredible wealth, Cornelius had lived a relatively modest lifestyle, consistently reinvesting almost all of his income back into his businesses. He owned a nice house but not a palace, traveled comfortably but not extravagantly, and focused almost all of his attention on business rather than luxury. In many ways, he lived more like a middle-class entrepreneur than the richest man in America. When it came time to distribute his fortune, Cornelius's will reflected the same ruthless calculation that had defined his business career. Approximately 90% of his wealth went to his oldest son William, who he considered the most competent and worthy of continuing the family empire. The remaining 10% was split among his other children and various relatives, with most of them receiving what he considered appropriate to their limited abilities and contributions. This distribution wasn't just about money, it was about power and legacy. Cornelius had spent his entire life building an integrated business empire, and he wasn't going to let it be fragmented by equal inheritance. He chose the son he believed was most capable of maintaining and expanding what he'd built, even though this decision created enormous resentment and legal challenges from his other children. Cornelius Vanderbilt was undeniably one of the most polarizing figures in American history. His enemies, and there were many, saw him as a ruthless monopolist who crushed competition, exploited workers, and accumulated wealth through methods that bordered on extortion. They called him a robber baron, a term that was essentially invented to describe him and others like him who built vast fortunes through what many considered antisocial business practices. But even his harshest critics had to admit that Cornelius had fundamentally transformed American transportation and, by extension, the entire American economy. His innovations in ferry service, steamboat operations, and railroad networks had connected different parts of the country in ways that made commerce faster, cheaper, and more efficient. The infrastructure he built became the foundation for America's emergence as a global economic power. More than that, Cornelius had pioneered business strategies that would become standard practice in American capitalism. His use of price competition to eliminate rivals, his focus on market consolidation and network effects, his willingness to operate at short-term losses for long-term dominance, these tactics are now taught in business schools as fundamental principles of competitive strategy. The man who started with a $100 loan from his mother had not just built personal wealth. He had helped build the economic framework that would make America the most powerful nation on earth. His story is simultaneously a testament to the possibilities of American capitalism and a warning about the dangers of unchecked economic power. Whether you view Cornelius Vanderbilt as a visionary entrepreneur or a ruthless monopolist probably depends on your perspective on capitalism itself. But there's no denying that his impact on American history was enormous and that his journey from impoverished ferry worker to the richest man in the world represents one of the most remarkable business stories ever told. He proved that in America, with enough intelligence, ruthlessness, and determination, it was possible to rise from nothing to everything, though the cost of that rise might be higher than most people would be willing to pay. If this story gripped you like Vanderbilt gripped America's economy, comment and subscribe to fuel more untold histories.